Welcome everyone to today's it's the fifth episode on our sixth series of policing through the art, connecting people and communities. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Taiwo Afolabi. I am here dialing in from the University of Regina. Thank you all for being here today. Deeply appreciate that once again. We started this series some couple of months ago, and it's been an interesting journey because we've been able to dive into different themes and different ideas that are of interest to our community. Like I said, my name is Taiwo Afolabi. I'm the Canada Researcher in Socially Engaged Theatre and the Director of the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre here at the University of Regina. I'm also an Assistant Professor in the Theatre Department. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Regina and of course the center are situated on the territories of the Nahiawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Mischief Nation. Of course, the University of Regina is on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. For me, when we talk about land acknowledgement, I always want to bring a personal angle to it. And today, for me, I just want to think about the various happenings that are particularly that happened to in our province some couple of weeks ago, which we involved really our officers taking on responsibilities and really thinking about what that means in terms of various experiences around violence, around killings, and the various social structures that and systems that bring that to bear. I'm originally from Nigeria. I moved to Canada in 2015. And so at every point in time, I'm also constantly thinking about what that means in terms of the political, in terms of the systems of governance and all the other social issues that are obviously affecting our, Nigeria and of course, other part of the world. That's my connection to this today, and you can type in the chat where you are dialing in from, and your connection to that land or to some of these issues. I also like to acknowledge two of my doctoral students that are working with me, Luba Kozak, who is not here today because she had to do a presentation at a conference on her research work. Really amazing doctoral student, I have to say. And of course, Ibukun Oluwafasun, who is here on the call today. And Ibukun's work is around site-specific theater and of course, policing. And Ibukun's doctoral work is really focusing on issues around Blackness and racism and all these kind of issues that are really critical to some of these topics that we're talking about. Some housekeeping piece here before I introduce our guest. We're recording, so I'll ask folks to put off your camera if you're not our guest, just to ensure that you're not in your video is not there. And after during the presentation at the Q&A session, you can either type your question on the chat box, or you can use any of the signs there to if you have anything you want to say, we'll be happy to to call you. I also want to acknowledge Karioko Sasaki. She's here. She's our intern at the center, working on all our communication. So all the email, all the social media and everything that goes out. Karioko is working on that, and really appreciate her our expertise at the center. Please note that at the end of this presentation, like we've done for the 4 episodes, we're going to have all of them. We're going to have it uploaded on our YouTube. So later on, folks who are interested can watch it. We have our 2 ASL interpreters here, Gabby and Jenny. Thank you for being here. Deeply appreciate that. And of course, there's live captioning option in case you need that. Just go under the more option and click on that on your Zoom. Importantly, what we're dedicated to creating a space for respectful conversation. And I always want to start this way because the issues around policing, it's very complicated, it's nuanced, it raises a lot of emotions and a lot of realities because of our various connections to it. So while we hope to engage in a lively conversation and strongly encourage dialogue, which is a very valuable tool for navigating sensitive topics, we're hoping that through the opportunity to create dialogue, that we can foster radical empathy. We wish to remind everyone to be a respectful listener and be mindful of their responses. For the purpose of our interaction today, we're defining respect as a way of treating and thinking about something or someone. A shorter version of that is to say, treat me the way you like me to treat you. Listen to me the way you like me to listen to you. We do hope that we'll have a great time together. So we encourage our panel and audience to ask questions, obviously, reflect, share in a way that humanizes and not dehumanize. For the audience, like I said, please use the chat box for questions, and then we're ready to dive into it. The first episode was around social dimensions of policing. It was really an opportunity for us to ask ourselves critical questions around what are the various elements that we need to consider when we talk about the subject policing. We moved from there to talk about mental health and what that looks like, both in terms of community and, of course, in terms of the police officers themselves, in terms of the support systems available and all that. After that, we talked about community engagement and what that means, particularly not just only to providing services, but really what does that mean for the community, and what's the way in for police, for a lot of our police services to think about that. And then finally, we talked, the next episode we talked about was around community policing and what that looks like. Today, we're talking about the very fundamental topic, police reforms. And I'm really excited to have two guests speak to us today about this. I have, just give me a minute here, just to ensure that I put my screen here. I have Dr. John Lilley and Chief Evan Bray, and I'll introduce both of them in just a minute. But what's interesting is that there are meant to be 3, Professor Liu, who couldn't attend today because they're under the weather. So our thoughts and our thoughts actually goes to them. If Dr. John Lilley and Chief Evan Bray can put on the video now, that would be great. Good to have both of you, and really thank you for being here today. I will quickly introduce both of them. I've had the privilege and the honor to connect personally to both of them, so it's really a great opportunity to be able to be having this conversation with them. Early, I think in the summer, Dr. John Lilley invited me as a keynote speaker in the conference at the amazing coalition for police reforms that he's a fundamental member of, and I know he's going to speak about that, because his heart and his passion is around reform. He speaks to curriculum, training, and things like that. So really, thank you for being here, Dr. John Lilley. And of course, our Chief Evan Bray, the first time I came to when I got first to Regina, and I was telling people about my research. They're like, you need to meet with the chief, and he was open, handedly, invited me over, and we had over an hour conversation, and I'm really really excited about the work that the chief and of course the entire team is doing. And I also want to say that this particular episode has we've been partnering particular with the Regina Police Service, and the response, thank you, Chief, the response from the team has been really, really great. If you want to read more about their bio, everything we posted on our website, and you can read extensively about it. I'd like to dive into the conversation because I think what we're talking about today is really, and again, both of you were talking about this earlier on before we started. It's a tough topic, and so I guess let's start from the basic. What does police reform? What does it mean to you? I like you to. I'm asking that because I want you to come into it from your own positionality, and before we get into the general, what it means to the community. What does it really mean to you? I can Chief Bray, you can start with us if that's okay. What does police reform? What does it mean to you?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm quite happy, honored to be joining you for this conversation today. And I think police reform is something that is really just a continuation of listening to our community. Some of the earliest principles of modern day policing date back to Sir Robert Peel. Many people have heard and know well about Sir Robert Peel, and he talked about the police are the public and the public are the police, and really those two, the intersection of that and the notion that the police are carrying out the public's expectations, I think are really at the heart of a conversation on reform, because reform in its most basic principle is about making change to something in order to improve it. And so why would I or any police leader in Canada be opposed to improving policing? It's to me, it would run counterintuitive to what we're trying to do, which is constantly enhance community safety. And by doing so, we have to be open to having good conversations on things like reform. And I think, and I was saying this just before we started in on this session, I think the notion of police reform takes on many, many different potential avenues and offshoots. So I think about it as a police chief, I think about it through a lens of service delivery. And so how do we reform, or how do we make changes to how we deliver service in the community? You could look at it through a lens of oversight and how oversight is provided. You could look at it through an HR lens. So what does training and recruiting and hiring look like? Certainly funding is an area, if you're talking budgets, funding, and all of those important things that every organization relies on. You could look at it through that lens. And I think probably as importantly, looking at reform through a philosophy lens. So it really is about how do we think about community safety? How do we think about policing? And how do we do it in a way that we're actually moving and changing the narrative, the philosophy around community safety? So those would be my opening thoughts on the notion of police reform.
Thank you for that concise, thought as an entry into police reforms, and what does that mean to you? And I'm going to come back, Chief, to the question of what does it mean for us in Saskatchewan. But I wanted to hear from Dr. John Lilley. What does it mean to you, particularly when you consider what the idea of the short, medium, and long-term reforms? What does, and I'll come to that, and because that idea came out of a Brookings Institute report about police reform. But what does it mean to you? What, based on your own work and what, your work and the things that you do and that you've done that you continue to do, what does that mean to you specifically, Dr. Lilley?
Well, Taiwo, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I got to say thanks, Taiwo, and if you could pass it on to Luba. It's great to be getting to know you, and you're doing great work. The concept that you're applying drama to the problems of society is in a direct fashion as opposed to just a commentary is really, really great. Now, short, medium, and long-term reform. I think I'd like to just give you a little bit of my background. I was a physician and I worked in the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Edmonton for my entire career. And that was no doubt, I trained in a colonial system and I practiced in a colonial system. And I remember bad things said in the doctor's lounge about Indigenous peoples, for instance, that I can't believe we said some of those things. But I believe I'm reformed now because I've worked for 10 years on a project called Pregnancy Pathways to house pregnant and homeless women. 70% of them are Indigenous. And I'm happy to say that with 10 years of work, we got that funded by the Alberta government and Alberta Health Services. So it's moving along. It still needs to grow. And then the other part of my background is as a police commissioner. So that's how I learned about policing. I cannot say I'm an expert in policing, but I saw it well from the governance side. And I think there were a lot of commissioners who didn't like me too much, but the police liked me. But it wasn't because I wasn't afraid to comment or criticize. It was because they knew I supported them. They knew that I just wanted better, that the police could have a better circumstance and the city could have better safety. So from the short-term perspective, people really drive by police stations without thinking about them, just like they drive by hospitals. But the day you want it, you want an emergency department without a wait list. You want an officer to respond now. And we've seen a lot of critical incidents in Canada this year and in the United States, around the world, that they're scary things. We need our police to be able to respond. So what would the reform be? It's really about achieving a consensus between citizens and police officers, police executives, and the politicians about moving forward to a 21st century model for policing. And once we have a consensus, we move to the medium term, and that would be the establishment of a college. And I'm going to say college in brackets. We call it the Canadian College for Police Professionalization, or words to that effect. There's no firm name we have chosen. But the point being is that we need to start moving forward to filling up the toolbox of each and every police officer with 21st century skills, and to give them the necessary information they need to know about a different Canada, a post-colonial Canada, a Canada that's responding and reconciling, hopefully, with Indigenous peoples. And it's a diverse Canada. So there's a lot of cultural knowledge and a lot of historical knowledge that police need to be cognizant of, to understand, in order to be responding in the right way to the individual they encounter. Long term, for in my mind, and this is probably 10 or 20 years, full professionalization, just like doctors, just like lawyers, just like accountants. And that would put police in a good place. They carry guns, they can use force, they can incarcerate people. So they need to be truly a learning profession, and a profession equipped with a focus on their customers, on the citizens that they're called to help.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lilley. This is interesting. So between you and of course, Chief Bray, you've sort of identified some couple of things, a lens through which we can look at the idea of reform: education and knowledge development, philosophical lens, service delivery, HR, funding. Now, I've kind of noted all of that, and I want to circle back, and maybe we're going to add more to this, right? But I want to circle back to Chief. What does police reform mean for us here in Saskatchewan, and particularly maybe here for us in Regina, as the Chief of Police?
Yeah, I think it means little bits from each of those buckets that I talked about. I don't think it's a one size fits all, and I don't think it's as simple as making a change to to one area and thinking that we've achieved reform. I do think that a lot of it has to do with how we deliver service. Sorry, I too am hearing some feedback, and I don't know. I've got my my microphone on and my monitor's turned down, but I'm just wondering if it's coming through for anybody else. Is it okay?
I think it's okay now.
Okay. Yeah, good. So, I think it comes down to looking at it again through all of those different areas. And so, I'll probably be giving lots of little examples as we go along, but we have in Regina, we have a group of very dedicated people who work in an organization called Mobile Crisis. And probably most communities in Canada have an organization that delivers the type of help that they do to the community. It could be anything from night shelter for someone. It could be helping people if there's a childcare issue. They're connected to social services. They're funded partly by government, but partly through other means as well. And so Mobile Crisis are an organization that we work very, very closely with on a day in, day out, night in, night out basis. And they're a group of people that probably have predominantly social work backgrounds, but are out in vehicles in the community at night, and they work hand in hand with police. In fact, we can even get a hold of them on a dedicated radio channel if we needed them to come to a house. So we just, in about the last 2 months, have drafted and signed an agreement with Mobile Crisis that in some cases, there may be files or calls that we get at the police service that don't really need the police. They need a response. It could be someone that needs help, but it may not be the police that they need. And so we are working with Mobile Crisis that we're answering the calls. So people call the police, but if we're talking about something that we feel Mobile might be able to handle, we'll talk with them. And ultimately, we'll dispatch them to the call instead of dispatching police. Every once in a while, they might say, could you come with us just to make sure it's safe? But our goal is that Mobile will handle the call and those types of situations. That's just one small example, but that is an example where I think we're reforming the way we think. We're not saying police have to go to absolutely every call, because police don't have to go. And in fact, many times, police aren't the best agency to help, but police are the only agency driving around in the community set up to take those calls. So, I think as much as we talk about police reform, it's also about me as a police leader advocating that we fund properly other community groups or other entities, might not be community groups, could be provincially funded organizations that can respond to social issues that police may not be in the best position to truly help the person who's in crisis.
Thank you, Chief. So the Human Rights Watch urged the United States Police Reform Initiatives to address 3 critical issues. One is reducing the role of police in addressing societal problems, which you sort of prefaced, Chief. The second one is investing in communities to advance public safety and equal rights. And of course, the third one is developing independent accountability and oversight mechanisms. Also in that report, and some other report that have gone and research that has gone into, around police reforms, one of the top areas that they've talked about that need to be looked into when it comes to reform is the idea of accountability and transparency. I'm going to ask you again this question, and then I'll move on to Dr. Lilley. In what ways do you think these 3 things, one, reducing the role of policing in addressing societal problems, investing in communities to advance public safety and equal rights, and of course, the third one, developing independent accountability and oversight mechanisms. In what ways are those things being explored here for us in Regina? And perhaps you could speak to the province as a whole.
Sure. Yeah. So I think those are 3 things that I had on my list of speaking notes that I, hope that I would be able to touch on today. So I'm going to start by saying I wholeheartedly support those three items. I think those are three things that literally we talk about in some form almost every day. So the notion of reducing the amount of kind of connection that police have to addressing societal problems. 80%, roughly 80% of the calls that police respond to in Canada are not criminal in nature. So 4 out of 5 times police are responding to a call where, they're going because there may be an element of danger, there may be an element of public safety, but ultimately doesn't result in criminal charges. And I think you don't have to look any further than domestic conflict calls. On average, Regina Police Service respond to between 20 and 22 domestic conflict calls per day. So every day we're responding to, let's say 20 of those calls. On average, 14 of them, so roughly 3/4, have no crime committed. 14 of them are some sort of a domestic relationship where there's been a breakdown, there's been arguing, there's been all kinds of challenging things that have happened, but nobody's going to jail, if I can be that blunt and that, kind of forthright about it. It's not criminal, but they need help. Maybe they need help. Maybe it's job security that's an issue. Maybe someone in the house is suffering with an addiction. Maybe someone has mental illness. Maybe there's some help with parenting skills that are needed. And so I can think of a grocery list of service providers in our community who can help that family with whatever their need is, and it may not be police. Now, I think there's probably an argument to say in many of those situations, depending on the situation, someone may not feel comfortable going into that house until they know it's safe, right? Because it's always the fear of the unknown. And someone has called the police to say, there's a big argument going on next door and it doesn't sound good. And I think you better get here before someone gets hurt. And so we get there and nobody's been hurt. There's been arguing, there's been yelling and whatever. But once we know it's safe, then how can we reduce the need for police to continue to be involved? Or maybe on the front end, reduce the need for us to even go in the first place and have other people that are willing to do it. And I talked about an example with our mobile crisis, how that's happening. In terms of investing in community to address safety issues, I think more and more that's starting to happen. I can't speak for obviously across Canada, but here in Regina, much like many communities, our council has stood up a community safety and well-being plan. And the focus of that is really to identify what are the main community needs. And really, when we're talking about social needs, it's basically there's a list of them, but they basically often will cover one person or two people will have multiple issues within those social needs. And so the community safety and well-being plan in our community is really going to be focused on trying to align services that we have in the community or services that other agencies provide. Could be a government agency, could be a community-based organization. How can we align those services with the needs of our community, especially from a social lens, and try and prevent some gaps and in some cases overlap. We have a couple of examples in Regina where we have community organizations that do incredible work, but they're all focused on this piece of work and nobody's doing this piece of work. So how can we stretch out so that we're aligned in a way that there are no gaps and we can provide, real tangible assistance to that? And finally, on oversight, I think we are continually seeing steps forward with regard to oversight. CERT in Saskatchewan stands for the Serious Incident Response Team. That's been stood up by government in Saskatchewan to really model, John, what you folks have in Alberta with ACERT, which is really anytime someone either dies in custody of police or is seriously injured in custody of police or by the actions of police, police will not investigate that, but this independent group funded through the government, through the Department of Justice, will come in and do that work. We're still in the early stages of that in our province, but it's when they are set up and operational, which I think they're hoping will be sometime in 2023, then if the Saskatoon Police Service has a police-involved shooting, they won't be calling the Regina Police Service to come up there and investigate with an appointed observer. They'll have a whole new process, and it's this process of the body that's been appointed as an independent agency to go in and do that investigative work. So without going on and on, I'll stop there. I actually have other examples of oversight that I'm happy to share as we go through this this next hour here, Taiwo, but I'll leave my comments there.
Well, thank you, Chief. And I'm still going to come back to your your governance, and policies and all that. I'm going to come back to that because I think that might also be an aspect I'd love us to explore. I want to come back to Dr. Lilley. So I did say earlier on that the Human Rights Watch so they ended up making 14 recommendations for police reforms, and the first one is under reducing the role of police in addressing societal problem, is to reject overly aggressive policing tactics like stop and frisk or those typically employed by police anti-gang units. They're saying whatever discriminatory stop and frisk policies and practices, that has to stop. Dr. Lilley, you were talking earlier on about curriculum, about education, and I want you to speak in detail what reform would look like from the perspective of this.
From the perspective of the training of police officers.
Exactly, in helping to stop all of these, the discriminatory, aggressive policing tactics. I can also add, some couple of months ago, a stat came out, and perhaps this was one of the places you saw me on the CBC News when I was making the commentary about the stats that is reiterating what we already know. A lot of the communities, particularly the racialized communities, they do not even trust the police. How much of that do you think training can help us in regard to this when it comes to this reform?
Well, first of all, we've never, as part of the coalition, said that we need to change how we recruit. But in truth, the recruits need to come in with a certain mindset, and it's not a mindset sort of post-military, I used to be a marksman, but rather the mindset of an individual with a broad education and a broad willingness to accept others. In other words, we need to select for people who are perhaps more naturally anti-racist. We need to select for recruits who have good emotional intelligence. And then we need to train them to a high level of proficiency in emotional intelligence. They still need to learn the important policing stuff. They still need to learn the criminal code and the traffic act and the methodology. We're not touching on methodology. Police are the experts in methodology. What we want to touch on are the soft skills that can make a big difference. So there was a video that I watched, and it was sent to us by Rose LeMay, who's a member of our board, and she's the CEO of the Indigenous Reconciliation Group in Ottawa. The video was a little bit of a drama that was established how the attitude of the officer, both verbal and nonverbal, can make a big difference in how in this case, a domestic violence problem was settled. So, if we're going to be loud and noisy and demanding and critical, then the outcome from that was going to be an individual, usually, who's going to up their level of aggressiveness. So when an individual, an officer, is highly trained in emotional intelligence, he or she should be able to hopefully I don't want to use the word control the conversation, but just like a physician or a psychologist who counsels people might be able to diffuse a situation far better. And then on top of that, if that individual officer understands the culture, so for instance, Taiwo, you came from Nigeria, and you say people from Africa are typically afraid of police because of their experiences from where they come. Well, if an officer is well aware of that and is aware that this person may be totally scared because all they have experienced is bad stuff from police officers, then he or she can change their approach. I don't really think I need to describe more of that, but emotional intelligence is all about that ability to sense the needs of the other. And some of that comes from just the situation at the moment, but also from experience, cultural knowledge. The same applies to Indigenous history in Canada, the colonialism, with knowledge of the suffering. And, I think the Pope's visit was really important for a lot of people to realize. Before that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, about what happened, the trauma that resulted. And, it's supported by the scientific literature. The people who suffer trauma, they think differently. They're wired differently. That's why we have to keep infants safe and secure and well-nourished with good parenting and excellent socialization opportunities to give them the skills they need to be strong and healthy adults who never get into trouble with the law.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lilley.
Can I just add one thing? I think John hit on something that is poignant. Can I just add a comment?
Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So his comment about really the tone of the police officer can really have an impact on how that situation unfolds. And we know that to be factual. So sometimes the presence of a police officer, the look, which could be the stance that the police officer is taking, those are all factors which can play into it. We're doing an exciting project right now with Holly Campo from the University of Alberta. And John, you may be aware of this work that she's doing in detention units. And so what Holly is doing is she's coming into our police service and she's interviewing people in detention. So these are people that have been arrested for one reason or another and find themselves in our detention unit. And she's doing a couple of things. Number one, she's exploring the notion of what in their life might have been different that might have prevented them from being there in the first place. So, she'll say to them, you're sitting here in police cells. What in your life might have happened differently that maybe would prevent you from being here in the first place? So it's giving them a chance to talk about some of those social challenges that they've encountered in their life that has led them to a path where they've had an intersection with police. But the other part of her project she's doing is she's interviewing not only the people that are in our detention unit, but the police officers who brought them in. And one of the things she's asking is, how did you determine the attitude you were going to take towards this person? And in both cases, the accused and the police officer, their answers are, well, it depends how they react to me. If I get there and they're amped up and they're angry and whatever, well then, I have to get myself to that level. And so I think as police, that's a clear message to us that we can't do that. And we shouldn't do that. And I know for sure, not all police do, but it's a natural reaction if someone's yelling at you to yell back, when in essence, de-escalation is based on not making the situation worse, but making it better. So understanding what John is talking about, understanding how our actions, our words, our demeanor, and just our overall awareness of the situation can give us the upper hand in handling things in a way that doesn't need to lead to force, or most times allows us to de-escalate it to a point where it doesn't mean we may not take the person to detention. We still have to make an arrest, but that interaction can look a lot different. And I think that's such an important point.
It's interesting, Chief, because I was going to go to you landed on where the question I was going to ask you about de-escalation. The report that I prefaced earlier on, the stats that I talked about earlier on, one of the things that was very obvious was in terms of the approach that the police officers are using when they have these encounters. And one of the key questions that we keep asking is, why use force when you have, why can't you de-escalate, particularly when we're speaking in regards to communities of colors, BIPOC and all of that. Chief, I'd like you to speak more to that, particularly is there what has been your experience or the experience of your officers, particularly when it comes to the use of de-escalation techniques in engaging with communities?
Yeah, thanks. I think we're definitely doing better today at focusing on de-escalation and training it than we did. I went through police college 27 years ago. We had a 2-hour session on verbal judo. And really that was the basis of it. When we learned the use of force model, officer presence and officer communication is an important part of that. But I think really now the way we look at de-escalation is, number one, de-escalation training. If we're talking about recruit training, it should be happening every day. There should not be a day goes by where they don't always land on the goal is to de-escalate the situation. That's the goal of policing, for goodness sakes. Our job is to come in and calm down, make sense of, slow things down, stop the hurt, stop the risky behavior, all of those things. That's what we're there to do. And so we should not be stepping in and making it worse. And so, use of force is something that is afforded to police in order to handle all situations, because we know some situations can be very, very challenging to end. But I also know that, I think that it comes down to the mindset. I heard John use the word mindset, and I think it does come down to a mindset. And there's lots of books and articles that have been written about policing of, whether you have a mindset of guardian versus warrior. Right? And what is your role in police? We are guardians of safety in our community. We need to think about ourselves that way, and we need to find ways that we can always focus on what can be the most positive outcome. So, I think de-escalation has to happen at the recruit level, obviously, the recruit level of training, but it needs to be a focus that permeates through an entire career. Any sort of training. We do block training every year at our police service. And so even something as simple as firearm qualifications should have an element of de-escalation built into it, focusing on communicating while you're holding a firearm in your hand, right? Because the second that you're holding that firearm in your hand, likely is because the situation is very risky, but it doesn't change the fact that you should be using this more than ever to try and de-escalate that situation. So I think it's about building curriculum, and I think probably lending itself more to John's expertise. The standardized way in which we train in Canada is something that I think we need to do a better job of, because while we have standardized training in provinces, quite often provinces will have some sort of directive that comes from the province that governs police training. There isn't a standardized bit of training across Canada. So how we train on de-escalation in Saskatchewan might look different than how they do it next door in Alberta. And I think it's important. This is a big enough thing that I think it's important that we find ways that we standardize that across Canada.
Thank you, Chief. Dr. Lilley, do you want to just comment a little bit about that, around the national, creating national standards for training and, of course, de-escalation? And again, this is part of your passion, right?
Sure. Well, first, I've got to compliment Chief Bray. I mean, he's got a learning service. If he's got Holly Campeau there from the U of A researching, obviously there had to be a consent process and an acceptance that academics had something to contribute. And that's a major step towards being a learning police service and a professional police service. Well, in terms of national standards, why are they important? I think the answer to that is that somebody has to focus on what the national standard's going to be. And that means they've got to look at the literature, the evidence that's out there. They've got to look at the nature of their communities. They have to see the gaps in evidence and fill in those gaps. They need to consult widely and then they can develop a standard. So in the end, a lot of work could be taken out of the hands of individual police services or individual solicitors general to deliver a national product that would include not just the standard for sort of standard on de-escalation, but the process of education around that standard, how to get the officers to the level they need to be to achieve the best results. And the best result is really about maintaining peace. That's what my friend and cohort in the coalition says, Dave Castles. He's listening in today, by the way, so it's making me sort of nervous. My goodness, Dave. In any case, the process of getting to national standards and implementing them is really how the change can happen. It makes it easier for provinces, for police services, and in the end, it results in a common product, so to speak. It results in individual police officers, just like you have individual nurses or individual doctors, who, whether you're in Inuvik or Tofino or Gander, you can understand that they're trained in an equivalent fashion.
Thanks, Dr. Lilley. This is great. Earlier on I'm just gonna do a quick, just some couple of points to summarize some of the police reforms ideas that have been presented. One is around accountability and transparency. Two, around excessive use of force, discriminatory stop and frisk police policies and practices, broken windows policing, inadequate training, the power of police unions in investigation and the discipline of officers, and of course, funding. I'm gonna take on the question of funding very soon, but there's a question here that it's open for for both Chief and of course Dr. Lilley. What kind of anti-racist training do police get? Again, we're going back to the idea of training, and it seems it's becoming really, really very important. I mean, at the heart of the reform, and how are police held accountable for this training? Is it those are two questions that we have here that has been sent that I want both of you to respond to. Maybe Chief Bray, you can start us with that, and I'll come to Dr. Lilley.
So it's funny when you said the term racist training. I mean, I know what you mean, but I can tell you, I mean, we don't do racist training. We do. We try and do
racist training. Sorry, anti-racist training.
Anti-racist, yeah, okay, yeah. So we do. I mean, I knew what you meant, Taiwo. I knew what you meant. But where I'm trying to go with this is we do a focus on education, I think is what I can say, and it starts with our process that we have to hire people. So we do extensive work up front to ensure that we're hiring people that don't have racist tendencies, haven't acted out, behavior that is indicative of that. And so there are some strict rules around that. And I think it's important to identify this is also an important reason why we should be hiring people reflective of our community, right? Because it's one thing to, if I can be so bold, have a bunch of white males in a room and do education training for them. But we're a much more robust police service and reflective of our community if we have gender diversity, if we have cultural diversity, and if we are reflective of our community that way. That in and of itself makes our police service a much more dynamic, culturally aware, and educated police service. And I can think of many personal examples from my career where that's happened. So having said that, we do training every year. I mentioned earlier, we do what we call block training. So we take every member of our police service, and for 1 week straight, we do training. And so we've brought in Dr. Merelda Potter, who's from the University of Regina. She works at First Nations University, actually. And so she does study Indigenous studies there. And she comes in and she has done basically a series of training for us over the years, starting out with what I would call it more of the history training in terms of the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, right through and including roundtable discussions on the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. So not standing at the front of the room with a PowerPoint, but giving each table one of the justice-related calls to action and having the officers at the table talk about it. And it was outstanding for me to hear what this conversation was like, because I had officers who probably hadn't given a second thought to FASD and the effects that it has on a community, but they were thoughtfully talking about it at a table. And they were offering ways in which they, as frontline officers, could illustrate this knowledge on various parts of the TRC calls to action through their work. And then the last part of work that she did with us was work where she gave our officers skills to help them every day in the community when they're knocking on a door to respond to a call for service, understanding to say, potentially to an Indigenous person, have you lived in Regina your whole life? And if they say yes, where's your family's community from originally? Talking about those types of things, understanding the importance of community. I just got an email the other day from one of my citizens in the city who said, Chief, I just want to let you know, you had an officer at my house today to take a report from me because my car was stolen. And this woman who is a community member that emailed me is an Indigenous woman. And she said, the officer that came out said, hey, today's an important day. It's the day that Treaty 4 was signed. And just that one little piece of tidbit of information, this lady was blown away, and it changed the conversation, because the two of them felt as if they had, something in common and they could discuss. So, I'm going to go back again. John used the term soft skills, and often that's what it's about. It's about understanding the importance of communication. So, Taiwo, I just gave you an example on the Indigenous community. We also have another community leader, Juliette Bouchy, who is part of she's actually on our board of police commissioners right now. Juliette has come in. She led the Black Lives Matter protests that happened in our community back in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. She was one of the leaders in Black and Sask, a community group that really was raising awareness about the Black community in Saskatchewan. Juliette is on our board, and Juliette also did training in our block training sessions to our frontline members and every civilian member of our organization on, Black history in Saskatchewan, challenges and perceptions of people in our community and what that might look like. I see my friend Ted Gilletta is on this call. Ted is a community leader and builder in Regina and is also on the Regina board, public school board. And so, I think it's just understanding, number one, the realities of what is happening, but in many cases, it's also about perceptions. And so Ted and I have had great talks about police officers in schools. Not even that there's examples where it's been bad, but it's also about how do people perceive police, and does that change their willingness to feel safe at school? So, I think just being open to these conversations and being able to meaningfully dig into them and see if there's a way we can make some reform and make some changes so that it meets the needs of our community, I think that's a positive thing.
Well, thank you, Chief. I think something that I'd love to do at some point is sort of create, because you were talking about perception and what people think about police. Love to create a drama piece around what the people's perception about police, and just even the simple question, police is. What does police mean to you? Those simple questions, it might be nice to kind of get those voice pop and also help us to find a way to start better understanding people's perception so that we don't assume, and of course, to also unpack all of those experiences. I want to go back to this. There's a second question that one of the participants did ask, and kind of connecting that to the power of police unions in investigation and the discipline of officers. That's part of one of the critical piece on the items tendered for reforms. I'll start with Dr. Lilley here. What are your thoughts on that? Because we're talking about training. How do we ensure that officers are accountable for this training? What are those things that are in place or we need to think about when it comes to enforcing accountability to this training, to this, to all of these things that we've been talking about? I'd like you to share your thoughts on that, and I'll come back to Chief.
Thanks, Taiwo. Well, first of all, I think we have to remember that 98% of police officers are wonderful people. It's like any profession, same in medicine. Some are not so nice. Some people are nasty to their patients, but actually achieve superb surgical outcomes. So maybe you can tolerate a little bad behavior there. But I mean, the truth is, yeah, actually, just as a point aside, there's so many similarities between medicine and policing. It's fascinating between healthcare and policing, really. Well, in terms of avoiding discipline, that's what you need to do, is to prevent incidents from happening. So if we can have the right officers trained the right way within a respectful environment, and who live and work in a setting where they're not being exposed to racist ideas and nasty talk and stuff scribbled on or posted on the insides of lockers. If the environment is respectful and equitable, if women officers are treated the same as men officers with the same opportunity to grow, all of that, you're going to have a happy bunch of people, and there'll be less harm come. If somebody gets angry, you can lose control, and that's, I'm sure, that causes a lot of disciplinary complaints for police. Then in that full professional environment, I think that we'll see that the complaints will fall remarkably. What we have to remember too is that complaints are something like, I think in Edmonton they were like 0.002% of calls for service. It's such a tiny little fraction of the interactions officers have with people.
Thank you.
Over to you, Chief.
Thank you, Dr. Lilley. I did mention the report and the research that came out of Brookings Institute, and I also want to say that Chief Evan Bray, I think based on the research and the collaboration that I think you're opening, the RSP to and the officers to, it's great. It sounds very collaborative and coming from different institutions across the country. So thank you for that, because I think based on our interaction, we know the place of research and engaging with an interdisciplinary approach to some of these critical ideas. So thank you so much. They did identify 3 levels of reforms. The short term, they said reform qualified immunity, create national standards for training and de-escalation. And I think we've kind of talked a lot about that. The second level is what they call the medium-term reforms, which include restructure civilian payout for police misconduct, address officer wellness. And then the third level of reform is what they call the long-term reform. They said restructure regulations for fraternal order of police contracts, change police culture to protect civilians and police. I know we've been kind of giving examples based on what we're doing in Regina, but I'd like us to actually go a little bit higher to talk about the systemic realities, the policies, right? I'd like the Chief to speak to the piece around in what ways do you think this reform, we can bring reform into issues of restructuring regulations for fraternal order of police conduct, police contracts, to issues around discipline, right? From a very systemic and policy standpoint, not just the one-off or the things that we're doing in terms of our service in Regina, which is great. But from that national standpoint, what are those things that we need to consider or reconsider in terms of reforms in those regards?
Yeah, that's an easy one, Taiwo. No problem. Yeah, I think a couple of things. You're really, I think, knocking at the door of standardization of training. And so whether it's de-escalation training or what, any sort of training and standards for policing, if we can get to a point where there's some national standards and I'm trying to think here. The completion of those standards is done by a group of people that are not police, but are people that represent the community. So, if you're wanting to see reform in policy, like if we just think about public policy, it's really about ensuring that the policy is reflective of the public who it's intended to serve. And so, putting together, a task force to work on use of force, you're going to need likely some people that are experts in that field. But I think it's equally, in fact, it's more important that you've got people that are set up who don't necessarily intimately understand the police world, but represent everyday Canadians who you are creating, a system that has to work for them. So I really think it's about having good representation in the development of any policy that you're developing, whether it's a social policy, a policing policy, whatever the case may be. I think that's an important part of it as well. And then mechanisms to measure how it's working and to make further reforms or adjustments to it if needed. So I'm going to pause there and just check with you, Taiwo. Am I on the right line of what you were looking for there?
No, yeah, please go ahead. I'm listening. I'm listening with a lot of curiosity. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so I think this is a case in point where I'll be the first to put up my hand and say, I'm in the middle of the forest. And sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. And so for me to talk, whether it's on this call with the leaders that we have here, or whether it's nationally, I can give you a perspective, but that perspective is I'm in the forest. And I'm working with and I'm dealing with trees all the time, but I don't always, even though you can try and lift yourself out of it, it's very tough to. And that's the charm and the balance that police boards, for example, can provide, because they're often community members or in some cases elected officials who for the most part have never been a police officer, maybe never even worked in the justice field. And so, like John, they bring their own unique lens based on their life and their history and their experience. And so finding ways to I think, provide different levels of oversight, because that's really what we're talking about. Even the drafting of policies is essentially oversight for policing. And so ensuring that that's done in a focused way that can be measured for success, and there's accountability mechanisms built into it for the agencies that are following it. So if it's national standards, then there has to be an expectation that police agencies across Canada will follow those standards. And if they don't, then what are the consequences? Do you lose your accreditation? Do you, I don't know. We know what consequences would be for individual officers if they are involved in some form of misconduct, because there's fairly robust systems to address that. I think we're looking at it now at a little bit of a higher level, and how do you as an organization display to the community that you're accountable and that you're holding yourself to the standard? And if you aren't, then what does that look like? I mean, I think in the truest sense, it looks like you have lost community trust. And we can't do our job without community trust. The community trust is 100% of why policing works. And if you have a community that doesn't trust you, doesn't value you, don't think you're transparent in what you're doing, then you've got nothing. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Chief. I want to come to Dr. Lilley. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
Well, one of the founders of the coalition, along with others, is a chap named Brad Cotton, who was an officer. He served his career in Brantford, Ontario, and he was in the training unit. He's now working on his PhD in Edinburgh. he actually got into dress uniform and was there as an honor guard for the transport of Queen Elizabeth's casket to the airport. But he's working on trust. He presented about trust at the conference, and we hope to get an update from him in a webinar later on this winter. But the point being is that the trust, as the chief has said, is the critical element of police being able to do their duty to Canada. Trust is a complex matter, and I had no concept about it until Brad Cotton had got into it, and the Lit Review has sort of revealed that it's about attitude front and center. It's about negative statements that build. It's about bigger events like the mass casualty event in Nova Scotia and the way the nature of the response to that. It's a complex matter. And in fact, what we're dealing with here in terms of Canada, everything is complex. The solutions are complex. We have an evolving world that's becoming increasingly fraught. We're living in a wonderful country that has justice, that has peace and solitude. And we need to preserve that as the world changes around us. So that's where the trust becomes an even more critical factor. You can see the polarization that occurs in the United States, which is making its way, sadly, into Canada. There's no trust with polarization. And that comes back around to police being in the community and being engaged with citizens. It's about citizens being involved in developing those national standards. It's about everybody participating. Those who want to should be able to participate. And they need to be able to freely call out what they don't like and learn. They need to be curious and they need to be humble. That's how we can move things forward.
Thank you. You both of you have raised an interesting piece around trust that might take us 2 hours to kind of dabble into that. Because part of, and I think some might have heard me say this over and over again, that it's interesting that within policing as a system, secrecy is also, it has some elements there, whether intentional or not intentional, whether it's of benefit or it's not of benefit. How do you wrap around building trust in that kind of system? How do you build a system where trust can be not only reclaimed, because to some level, there's a level of, to some degree, there's a level of distrust. So we want to reclaim trust, but at the same time, we want to sustain it. But how can you build that within the current ethos or system that we have? When secrecy, when it's not meant to, when it doesn't really benefit the community, at that times that it does, based on the kind of job that the offer, the police are involved with. How do you do that? And again, this might be an existential question that we don't have answer for. I'm just going to drop that there. If you have thoughts on that, because I think that if trust is a currency that we need to hold tightly to, and for lack of a better word, currency, and that same trust has been trodden, and continually we see that trust not being held in a high esteem, then how would we expect the community to yet give us to have trust in us?
Well, I'll add one thing to that, and then I think Chief Bray better speak. The truth of the matter is, Tyrone, trust is person to person. It is not group to group necessarily. And so that's where the police officer's approach to the citizen and the citizen's approach to the police engenders trust. Just by being humble, by listening, by taking the time. And it has to be within a peaceful environment, obviously. If there's a lot of stress going on around you in the country or on that street where you might encounter an officer, it's difficult to build trust. So that actually would point to the need to get moving here on a change agenda. And when people have concerns, but they see concerns are being addressed, then that elevates trust too. Lies are bad. We've seen that with politicians in Canada and the US.
Chief, I know you're going to add something, but I want to take what Dr. Lilley said. Trust is from one person to one person. I do agree, but we also have to find a way that the system that we can trust the system. So while the individual piece from one police to the office to one officer to the citizen is important, and we have to do that, how do we ensure that that trust becomes, engraved within the system?
Yes. Yeah. Can we just say what an outstanding job Gabby and Jenny are doing? Like, they're rock stars. Their hands must be tired, but good job. So, I'm going to tell you a story, Taiwo and everyone on the call, just to talk a little bit about trust. So there was a project that actually started in the United States called the Philadelphia Project. And so what the Philadelphia Project was about a large number of sexual assault investigations that there was a feeling that they weren't being investigated properly. There was a feeling as though most people were not reporting sexual assaults to the Philadelphia Police Service because there was very little trust that they would take them seriously, handle it correctly, all of these types of things. So I listened to a presentation on that once, and there was a lady who runs the Sexual Assault Center in Ottawa by the name of Sunny Mariner, who was trying to get some momentum to get this sort of work being done in Canada. And so, long story short, I approached Sunny, and I'm proud to say that we're running a program here. We're in our 4th year now of running this program called Violence Against Women Advocate Case Reviews. And what this is we're bringing in people that are not police officers, but people that work in and with survivors of sexual assaults and sexual violence to come in and review all of our sexual assault investigations. And so you can imagine what my police officers thought when I said, hey, everyone, just to let you know, all of your sexual assault investigations are going to be reviewed by non-police community members who have some training and background and education in sexual assaults and sexual violence. I don't think anybody was jumping up and down about it, because it doesn't matter if you're a doctor or a university professor, the notion that someone's coming in to review your work and make suggestions for change automatically gets people worried about what's the intent here, why are we doing this? And the intent truly was to build trust in our community with regard to reporting sexual assaults and sexual violence and our ability to investigate it. And so, in year 1, when we started this as a pilot project, it wasn't only that they were looking at it to say maybe an investigative step was missed, because most times what they were talking to us about were things that had nothing to do with the investigation and more to do with the procedure of investigating. For example, a young gal called police to report a sexual assault. Police attended to her house and said, we would like to take you to the hospital because we would like to have a sexual assault examination done. They were driving a police car with a silent partner, so that's that hard shield that divides the front and the back, and they asked her to sit in the back of the car and they transported her to the hospital. I mean, obviously she wasn't under arrest, but that didn't, I'm sure, make her feel like she was being prioritized and being treated respectfully, because our backseat of our police cars are not welcoming. They're tight spaces, they're hard seats, there's a barrier there between the front and back. And so in the first year, a suggestion was, if possible, can you transport a victim of sexual assault in the front seat of the police car, even if it means calling someone else to, if you have 2 officers, or maybe one of the other officer or the other officer rides in the back seat. So that's a procedural justice change that has been made of that. So here we are 4 years later. They just did a review 2 weeks ago. Again, 4 or 5 individuals that work for the Regina Sexual Assault Center. And they said, honestly, Chief, we're actually having trouble giving you a list of things that you need to work on. Like, we're reviewing these files. The way you're interacting with people is outstanding. The procedures that you're taking are compassionate and not re-victimizing. You're doing all of your work from a trauma-led a trauma investigative lens to understand how trauma affects people when you're doing these investigations. And the executive director of the Regina Sexual Assault Center said, over the last 2 years, the number of sexual assaults reported to police have more than doubled in our city. And a lot of that has to do with the people that work at the Regina Sexual Assault Center trust implicitly the work that we're going to do on the investigation. We allow advocates to sit with people that are doing these reports. And so what have we done? That's a long story for me to tell you. We've enhanced trust dramatically in the area of sexual assault investigations. And as a result, we have advocates that are working with victims and survivors of sexual assault saying, you should report to the police. They do great investigations. We do follow-up. We basically review all of the investigations that they do, and they work hand in hand with community to make this whole process as least victimizing or re-victimizing as possible, and ultimately finding a way to help you heal. So that is one small example that I think is huge in showing the benefit of building trust in a community.
Wow, thank you. It's really great to hear all of this project. I don't read about them, so I'm excited that Chief is telling us this great project, research and all these things happening. I know we have 12 more minutes to the end of this session. And so those on the call, if you have questions, please continue to send that to me. I'll be happy to answer them, to ask them, or if you want to talk, please let me know. I want to go to funding. That's the last beat that we're yet to touch. And there's a lot of debate around the idea of defund police. And there is no way we're going to talk about police reforms without this conversation around funding. I'd like both of you to weigh in on that. Again, I'm not, the whole idea is for you to give your perspective. You can give everybody's perspective. Where should funding go? Why should funding go to those places? A lot of questions around defunding, right? That I think that I'd love to hear your perspective around that. I'll start with Dr. Lilley, and then we'll come to the chief.
Thanks, Taiwo. In terms of funding, I think we have to look at the whole basket of resources available to all levels of government. The truth is there's a lot of work to get done and not enough funds to deliver that work, whether it's helping mothers have healthy term pregnancies, families having good parenting skills, whether it's smaller classroom sizes, whether it's expanding the permanent funding to support individuals who have chronic health problems or mental illness. All of this, it goes beyond. We can move on to acute health care. We can talk about adequate legal aid. There are a million places to put money, and there's never going to be enough money. But I truly believe that if you want to bang for your buck, it's in primary prevention. So if you look at the Palix Foundation in Calgary, they published a document, or they have a whole education program called The Brain Story. But there was some preceding research to that, which demonstrated that $1 invested for an infant could prevent as much future morbidity, I guess I'll say, as investing $7 when they're in school or $15 when they're a teenager. In other words, start early and you'll have much more effective results for the money invested. Not only will you see better results, but you'll have happier kids and happier adults. That's what it's all about. We all want to be happy, right? So in terms of police funding, I don't think it's changeable. I think it's got to keep on increasing. We've got an increasingly unstable circumstance in the world. We're seeing more and more mass casualty things. It's awful. So we just can't go cutting and defunding. It's not possible. But we need to get going on primary prevention. And the truth of the matter is, the taxes aren't high enough. Everybody goes around trying to cut the taxes and cut the rates. And I'm not a socialist, I'm a centrist, but we need to be paying more. And that's the simple matter.
Chief, over to you. And I know I'm bringing up question of funding at the last minute. So my apologies, because I imagine that it's going to raise more questions, but I'd like to respond to it, Chief.
Yeah, so I think John's hit on a couple of really good points. I know I've seen lots of reports in the community safety and wellness area that every dollar spent from a prevention side saves on average $17 down the road. So if you look at that in terms of some of the social determinants of health, of crime, whatever you want to talk about, preventative money being spent, up front on addictions or issues of gangs or any of that is often going to pay dividends. And so, I think John and I were talking briefly off air prior to going on air, and John used the term generational. I think that's the way we need to understand is it is possible. It is absolutely possible that as we move forward and we make thoughtful investments in community safety, that we will get to a day where we need less police. I think that is very possible. In fact, I should be advocating for that as a police officer. I should want a society that doesn't need very many police officers as opposed to one on every street corner, because our goal is constantly to end crime and enhance public safety. So, I think if we can invest in that, the problem is there's a lot of people that feel it's an either or conversation. And in 2022 and 2023, it can't be. You can't say, let's take this big chunk of money from police and give it to X, community associations, addictions, homelessness, because the challenge is, again, those changes that the investment in social programming is going to make them in, maybe we're going to start to see it in 5 years or in 10 years, but it is going to be slow generational change. And tonight, there are going to be priority one calls for service waiting in my city, regardless if you take $5 million out of my budget today or add $5 million to my budget. I've often said, and I've said this to our council, I have not ever promised that if you give me, the police, more money, that I can solve society's problems. But what I am trying to do is meet society's needs, because everything we do as a police service is based on what the community is asking us to do. And the community is asking us to do it by, sadly, dialing 911 and calling us, putting in calls for service. And we have trouble keeping our head above water because of those calls for service. And so I think as aggressively as we work to handle those calls for service, we have to be equally aggressive as a police service and as police leaders to work with community partners on all those things that we've talked about for the last hour and 24 minutes in terms of building partnerships, enhancing trust, using data and analytics and research to help drive decisions that we're making so that we get the best outcomes, that whatever is going to be best for society. And so, to me, again, back to the basic concept of defunding, I think defunding kind of has two veins to it. There are people that are anti-police and say, let's just take money away from police. But I think the truer sense of defunding is this notion of reform. And so how can we better focus energy, effort, resources, and funding to deal with community issues? And so we can't be offended by that. If defunding the police is something that's going to happen over the next 25 years by continuing to not only give police the tools we need to handle community safety issues, but properly investing in social issues so that eventually you need less police, then I'm all for it, because I think that's where we need to get to, is finding better ways to have sustainable change, not locking up someone overnight so that they don't commit another crime, but doing nothing to address the root cause or the issue that's put them in that place in the first place. If we can address those over time, we're going to see a much healthier society.
Thank you so much. There's the last question here. I know we have 4 minutes to the end. One of the participants asked, can the chief please reiterate some of the measures being taken to end police brutality in Regina and in Saskatchewan?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. Number one, I think it starts with robust efforts at the recruiting stage. So understanding and finding ways to recruit people that not only are tested to ensure that they don't have a background or something in their background that could be harmful to the cause of policing and enhancing safety, but also recruiting and hiring people that are truly reflective of the communities that we serve. I think it starts there. And then throughout their career, continuing to find ways to enhance education, give them understanding and perspective of the community that they serve. It's about building a culture where those soft skills are rewarded and applauded as much as someone who can, make a hard tackle on an arrest. I can tell you, in a policing career, sometimes force needs to be used, whether we like it or not. Sometimes when we're making an arrest, and we just had a very tragic high-risk situation in the province of Saskatchewan a week ago, where the city and the community and the whole province was on vigilant alert about a mass murderer who people were terrified. And so that case, police really didn't need to use much force. There was a bit of a force used to get the vehicle off the road, but other than that, there was not a lot of force used in making that arrest. And I'm thankful for that. But we were all anticipating the possibility that he might cause police to use force against him in a way to end that situation. And so, we have to understand and build a culture that is constantly focusing on de-escalating situations, resolving them where possible without using force, and then also ensuring that we have really strong mechanisms in place that will handle the investigation and discipline of members and potentially removal of members who are using force inappropriately, abusing their positions as police officers, and ultimately giving the profession of policing a bad name. So I think it's kind of, cradle to grave, if you will, almost, that we have to start right from hiring, and we have to have a process that's in place that follows officers through their career to ensure that they're being trained and educated, they're surrounding themselves with people reflective of the community, and they understand the serious consequences that can happen if they step offside.
Well, thank you so much, Chief Bray. You sort of done my job for me of recapping the entire thing. We have 1 more minute. So I would like Dr. Lilley, any last thoughts? Because so that we can wrap things up. I want to be very mindful of our time. Any last thoughts, Dr. Lilley?
Yeah, let me give a promo. Go to c-cpr.ca. Either sign up for the newsletter or pay your $25 to become a member, or soon you could donate. We're now a registered charity. We need support because it's the number of people who are behind us that will be effective in making our case going forward. We also need volunteers, social media. We need a board secretary. There's my promo. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Deeply appreciate Dr. John Lilley and of course Chief Evan Bray, as always, for being part of the conversation today. The video will be up on our YouTube channel for anybody that wants to watch it. And I think that I'm really amazed by the kind of research and work that is happening at RPS. So thanks to the chief and of course his entire team. Our last episode is happening on the 21st of October. And we're going to be talking about theater, justice, and policing. So looking forward to that. And then after that, we pivot to the next line of action in the next line of activity in our research around policing, theater, and policing. Thank you so much. We've also launched the Art Justice and Art Act. It's a compile. We're calling out for folks who want to write a play, a form of expression about their experience of policing, whether bad, whether positive, and everything in between. And all of that details is actually on our website at cset.ca. Once again, thank you everybody for being here today. Thank you to our interpreter, Gabby and Jenny. Thank you so much. And of course, thank you to all of you that did wait to the end of the session. And again, thank you to Dr. John Lilley and of course to Chief Evan Bray.
Thank you, Taiwo. Thank you so much for being interested in policing and how we can improve stuff. And Chief, it was great to work with you, Evan, today to have our conversation.
You bet. I'm sure we'll work together again. Thanks, John. And
Okay.
thanks, Taiwo.
And